Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The village of Much Compton rarely offered more than a scandal about a neighbor's overgrown hedge, or a quarrel about jam recipes. So when Madame Orlova, the traveling fortune teller, was found dead in her caravan the morning after the village fair, it caused an upheaval that clutched at the very throat of the quiet countryside. Her body had been discovered by young Dora Appleton, who had been sent back to retrieve a forgotten scarf. The girl had screamed so sharply that two nearby farmhands ran over, only to find the door to the small painted caravan locked from the inside. They broke it open to reveal the woman collapsed over her round table, a deck of tarot cards scattered beside her, and a half-drunk cup of tea that had gone cold. The peculiar part, however, was not the death itself. Villagers first assumed a heart attack, but rather what lay next to her hand, a single white chrysanthemum, fresh as though just plucked, resting on the card of death reversed. Dr. Bentley, who was called immediately, pronounced her dead but could not determine a cause. There were no marks on her body, no sign of poison, and no indication of struggle. The tiny window was latched from the inside, and her caravan door had been bolted. Yet something felt off. The tea had been poured not long before her death, and there were two chairs at the table, one of which was pushed out as though someone had risen in haste. There was no second cup and no trace of a visitor. And who had brought the chrysanthemum? Madame Orlova had told Mrs. Tilling just the previous afternoon that she loathed the flower. It reminded her of funerals, she said, and she wouldn't allow them near her. The villagers began to whisper. Perhaps she predicted her own death, said old Mrs. Partridge at the bakery queue. They say she told Mr. Ridgely he'd fall into water before autumn ended. And look, he sprained his ankle by the duck pond yesterday. She had the sight, she did. But others weren't so certain. A woman like that makes enemies, muttered Constable Reeves, who had never trusted those Romany types, though Madame Orlova wasn't Romany at all but Polish, with a talent for theatrics and an accent that danced around the truth. The fair had ended late the night before. People had passed her caravan on their way home. Some said they'd seen a light on well past midnight. One or two claimed to have heard voices, but no one could say who might have visited her last. Her ledger book of appointments ended at 9:15 with a Mr. Sims, who swore she was alive when he left. Her money pouch remained untouched, her belongings undisturbed. No footprints around. The caravan, no scuffle, no open lock. Yet the chrysanthemum did not grow anywhere nearby. The vicar's wife, who often prided herself on her calm nerves, fainted during the funeral sermon when the vicar mentioned the word final, recalling the fortune-teller's habit of ending her readings by whispering, "And that will be your final turn." The scene took a darker tone when, after the burial, the gravedigger mentioned quietly that someone had been seen at the cemetery late the night before. Someone small, wearing a shawl and moving slowly between the graves. Nothing had been disturbed, but a chrysanthemum had been laid on the grave of a local woman who had died the previous year. No one could explain it. With the local police baffled and the post-mortem yielding no answer, heart failure, the coroner declared, though not confidently. It was not long before word of the case reached Miss Marple through her distant cousin Hester, who had attended the fair and returned to St. Mary Mead rattled by the news. "It doesn't sit right with me," she told Miss Marple over tea. A healthy woman, cheerful, strong-willed and suddenly dead, locked inside her own caravan with a flower she despised, and those cards scattered like she was interrupted. Miss Marple, who had once been read by Madame Orlova and found her eerily perceptive, tilted her head and asked just one question. Did the flower face toward the door or away from it? Hester blinked. Toward the door, I believe. Why? But Miss Marple did not answer directly. She only reached for her knitting bag and said, "I believe a visit to Much Compton might do me good. Fresh air, you know, and perhaps a conversation. Or two." Before the day was done, she had sent a note ahead to the vicarage, requesting a spare room and expressing her condolences. By the time she arrived the next morning, the village was already murmuring about her presence, some with hope, others with wariness. And among the villagers who had something to hide, the sudden interest of a quiet, elderly lady from St. Mary Mead was not comforting at all. Miss Marple arrived in Much Compton just after luncheon, her demeanour as mild and unassuming as ever, with her sensible shoes tapping softly on the gravel as she stepped out of the vicarage car. She declined tea for the moment, expressing a gentle wish to stretch her legs and take in the fairgrounds while the remnants of festivity still lingered. The bunting flapped tiredly in the breeze, the field now nearly empty save for a few volunteers dismantling stalls. The fortune-teller's caravan stood where it had been parked, though cordoned off with a frayed rope and watched half-heartedly by a constable, who seemed more interested in carving at an apple with his pocket-knife than guarding a crime scene. Miss Marple offered him a kindly nod, which he returned without much suspicion. She remained just outside the rope, letting her eyes drift over the caravan with the curiosity of an elderly woman remembering happier days. To anyone else, the scene looked unremarkable, but to Miss Marple the stillness held a stiffness, as though something had been rearranged hastily. The caravan's steps had one of its treads broken, an old crack surely, but the dirt beneath the steps was freshly disturbed, not flattened, as one might expect after a week's worth of foot traffic. Nearby, the dry grass had been pushed down in a semicircle, not quite in line with the caravan door, and certainly not the kind of mark left by a visitor standing naturally. She did not mention any of this aloud, of course. She simply turned to the constable and asked if anyone had seen fit to examine the flower. Flower? He said, puzzled. The white chrysanthemum, I believe, the one found beside Madame Orlover's hand. He frowned. Dr. Bentley said it might have fallen from the bunting. There were flowers pinned to the stalls for decoration. Were there chrysanthemums among them? I don't know. Didn't think to look. Quite right, Miss Marple said mildly, adjusting her gloves. It's only that chrysanthemums are rarely pinned to bunting, being so heavy-headed and so funereal in meaning. Rather morbid for a village fete, wouldn't you say? He looked vaguely uncomfortable. Can't say I noticed. That's often the trouble with village affairs. So many little details to overlook. She offered a brief smile and moved along. Her next stop was the village green, where several residents had gathered for idle chatter, which predictably shifted the moment they saw her. Miss Marple had long since learned how to disarm gossip with gentleness. She found Mrs. Ridgely sitting on a bench crocheting something lumpy and beige, and joined her as naturally as if they'd known each other all their lives. Within minutes, she learned that the fair's organizers had been squabbling over stall placement, that the vicar's wife had burst into tears twice during the raffle draw, and that Madame Orlover had refused an offer of hot cocoa that night, saying she expected someone soon. She said it like she was waiting for a guest, Mrs. Ridgely recalled. I thought it strange. All her appointments were done, weren't they? Miss Marple tilted her head. Did she seem uneasy? Not at all. Calm, but definite. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had walked the fairgrounds twice, spoken to 3 neighbours, and borrowed a copy of the coroner's preliminary report through an old friend in the vicar's circle. It confirmed what she suspected: no signs of physical trauma, no trace of common poisons, and death listed as unexplained, possibly cardiac. But it was the final line that interested her most. Traces of mint and aniseed found in digestive, tract possibly herbal tea. No mention of chrysanthemum oils or pollen. She tucked the report away, letting the pieces drift gently into the back of her mind. When she called on Dr. Bentley that evening, she brought with her a jar of jam, from the vicarage and the air of a woman interested only in recipes. He was taken off guard but pleased by the visit, and soon found himself answering her idle questions with increasing detail. She was strong as anything, he admitted. Good heart, clear lungs. Nothing that should have caused a sudden collapse. But it happens, rare. but not impossible. And the tea? I assumed chamomile at first, but it had that odd tang, mint and something sharper. She brewed her own blends, I believe. You can't be too precise with these herbalists. Of course not, Miss Marple murmured. And the cup, did it seem touched by another? He blinked. Now that you mention it, the lipstick mark on the rim was smudged. Could have been hers, but oddly placed. Left side. Yes, left side. Most people drink from the right, don't they? If they're right-handed, yes. But if the cup had been turned? Dr. Bentley rubbed his chin. You think someone else handed it to her? I think it's possible the cup was replaced after she lost consciousness, perhaps by someone who wanted it to seem natural. He fell silent. That night, Miss Marple sat quietly in her guest room, knitting untouched in her lap. The image of the flower returned to her, the single chrysanthemum on the death card. A showy detail, unnecessary unless one wished to send a message. But who was the intended audience? The villagers, the constable, or perhaps the victim herself? She reviewed the witness statements Hester had collected. Mr. Sims had been the last scheduled client, but he had left early. Several fairgoers said they'd heard soft talking in the caravan later, but only one remembered a voice that stood out. A soft whisper, like a child or a woman trying to be quiet. That witness had been ignored by the constable, who thought it too vague, but Miss Marple clung to it. A childlike voice, a whisper, not fear, but secrecy. She rose from her chair and opened her window slightly, letting in the cool night air. Somewhere nearby a dog barked once and then went quiet. In the distance the old church bell rang 9 times. She thought of the grave digger's tale. Someone wandering the cemetery the night before the burial, leaving a second chrysanthemum on another grave. Someone with a reason for both deaths, or perhaps a reason to link them. She closed the window gently. Tomorrow, she would visit the graveyard. But tonight, her mind lingered on the peculiar mention of the reverse death card, and the memory of someone she had nearly forgotten. A woman from another village, who had died last year under equally vague circumstances, and whose name had once appeared in the same parish bulletin as Madame Orlover's travelling schedule. 2 deaths, 2 chrysanthemums, and perhaps, buried in the silence of Much Compton, 1 motive. The following morning, Miss Marple rose early, and, after a modest breakfast of toast and stewed prunes, made her way to the churchyard. The vicar, having heard of her interest, met her at the gate and walked her down the gravel path toward the older graves. He pointed to a headstone partly hidden by ivy. Judith Crail died the previous October. Such a strange thing, he murmured. Her passing wasn't sudden, but the gesture, the flower, the way it was placed, it startled Mr. Griggs, our gravedigger. Said it was too deliberate, like it meant something. But who leaves chrysanthemums for a woman with no family? Miss Marple asked a few questions about Judith, her health, her friends, and her occupation. She kept to herself. The vicar said, did odd jobs, accounting work for villagers. She helped with Madame Orlover's records, actually. They became quite friendly in an odd way. That, to Miss Marple, was more than coincidence. 2 solitary women, drawn together, one keeping books and the other telling fortunes. She filed it away silently. By mid-morning she returned to the fairground and requested to speak with the last known visitor. Mr. Sims, a pale, twitchy man with the permanent air of someone expecting bad news. He sat across from her at the vicar's garden table, shifting in his seat. She was fine when I saw her, he insisted. She read my cards, said something vague about a turning point, and I left. Nothing odd about it. Miss Marple smiled gently. She didn't seem upset. Distracted, he hesitated. She paused once, looked toward the window like she'd heard something, but then she just laughed and said the spirits were being playful. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "And how long were you with her?" 10 minutes, perhaps 15, he replied too quickly. "And you left alone?" "Yes," he said, "definitely alone." She let the words hang a moment. "You see, someone passed her caravan shortly after 9. They said they heard 2 voices. That wouldn't be you, I suppose." His fingers tightened on the teacup. "No. Maybe she had another client. Someone after me. Even though her ledger ended with your name." His mouth opened, then closed. "Perhaps she had an unlisted appointment." Miss Marple changed the subject gently, inquiring about his job, his background, even complimenting his coat buttons. But her mind remained on the window. If Madame Orlova had looked toward it during Sims's reading, perhaps she had seen someone. Someone she recognized, or feared. When the questioning ended, he stood too quickly, nearly knocking his chair back. He muttered a farewell and hurried off, forgetting his gloves. Miss Marple picked them up with care and noted something peculiar. There was a faint stain on the left thumb, like dried oil or crushed herb. She placed them neatly on the table and said nothing. Her next conversation was with Mrs. Tilling, a woman of dramatic moods and self-importance who had known Madame Orlova better than anyone. She sat rigidly upright on her drawing-room sofa and waved her teacup for emphasis. "That poor woman confided in me, you know. Told me things she didn't tell the rest. She knew she was in danger." "Did she say why?" asked Miss Marple. "No, but she kept talking about debts. Not money, no. Emotional debts, I think. People wronging her old scores. She was frightened." "And did she mention names?" "Oh, no, but I suspect it was about Judith, the woman who died last year. They argued, you know, a row outside the post office. And after Judith passed, Madame Orlova started drinking more. Herbal nonsense, but still. She wasn't herself." Miss Marple nodded politely. "And you didn't happen to see her the night she died?" "Heavens, no. I was at home with my sister." "Your sister from Leeds?" "Yes. Though she's hard of hearing and couldn't possibly confirm the time I came in." She smiled thinly. "But I assure you I never went near the caravan." "Did you know she disliked chrysanthemums?" The cup froze mid-air. She said they reminded her of her grandmother. "I gave her one once and she scolded me." "And did you ever bring them to her again?" "No," said Mrs. Tilling, then added quickly, "at least not intentionally." Miss Marple thanked her and excused herself. As she walked back through the green, she paused near a bench where young Dora Appleton sat with a book. Miss Marple asked if she might join her and received a shy nod. "It must have been a shock," she said gently. "Finding her." Dora nodded. "I wish I hadn't. I liked her. She gave me a little stone once, said it would protect me from lies." "That's curious," Miss Marple said. "Do you remember what it looked like?" "Yes, it was blue, like glass, but she warned me not to tell lies either, or it would stop working." Dora hesitated, eyes shifting. "I did go back that night. I didn't forget a scarf. I was going to ask her if she meant what she said." "What did she say, dear?" "She told me to be careful of people who pretend to help. That some people wear masks for years, but masks always slip." "And what happened when you got there?" Dora looked down. "I saw someone leaving. I didn't tell anyone. I was scared." Miss Marple waited. It was Mrs. Tilling. She had a flower in her hand. She looked scared too. Miss Marple remained silent for a long moment. "You've been very brave, Dora. Sometimes telling the truth is the hardest thing we can do." She patted the girl's hand and turned her gaze back toward the caravan. The pattern had begun to form. Judith Crail had kept Orlova's records, a financial connection, perhaps secrets shared. A fallout. Judith dies mysteriously, and a year later, Orlova follows. After warning others, after hinting at danger. Mr. Sims, twitchy and nervous, lying about how long he stayed. Mrs. Tilling, desperate to play the confidant, possibly hiding her own involvement. And somewhere beneath it all, the chrysanthemum, a symbol placed with intention. Not a warning, but a mark. A ritual, perhaps. A signature. As Miss Marple stood, a passing breeze caught the edge of her scarf, and for the first time she noticed the faintest scent lingering in the air, not just aniseed, not just mint, but something earthier, sharper. Crushed marjoram, she thought, often used in teas for clarity or sleep. She remembered the smudge on Mr. Sims's glove. There were more lies still hidden, and the voices of deception were growing louder. But she had heard enough now to know where to listen next. Miss Marple spent the afternoon wandering through the quieter corners of the village, seemingly at ease. Yet her mind was weaving threads tighter with each step. She stopped briefly at the grocer's to inquire about supplies, and happened to mention Madame Orlova's fondness for herbs. The grocer, an excitable man with poor memory for receipts but a sharp tongue for village chatter, remembered selling her mint, marjoram, and a small jar of ground valerian root 2 weeks prior. Odd thing, he added. She usually came herself, but that last time she sent someone, a young lad. Wouldn't say a word, just handed the list. Paid with a 10-shilling note. Miss Marple thanked him and left, already thinking of ways to determine who the errand boy had been. At the vicarage that evening, she laid out her notes. Judith Crail, the deceased bookkeeper, had handled Madame Orlova's financial records, likely more than just receipts and coin tallies. If the fortune-teller truly had secrets, Judith may have known them. Their friendship soured shortly before Judith's death, which Miss Marple now believed to be the true beginning of this affair. What if Judith had discovered something in Orlova's affairs? A deception, perhaps? Manipulated readings, false names, or worse? Or had Judith herself been involved in something that Orlova threatened to reveal? The answer seemed to hinge on that rupture in their bond. The village librarian, a reserved woman named Miss Greaves, proved unexpectedly helpful when Miss Marple inquired about Judith's background. She came from London, lived with her aunt for a while, took a great interest in palmistry and numerology, used to borrow every book we had on the subjects, then suddenly stopped last year, went quiet, kept mostly to herself until she passed. When asked about her death, Miss Greaves paused. The doctor said it was a seizure. She was found in bed, a cup on the table, books on the floor. No autopsy, no one asked for one. But I always thought, well, she looked peaceful. Too peaceful for a woman who had screamed at Madame Orlova in the street the week before. That scream seemed more pressing now. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Carter, who had witnessed the argument. Judith accused her of betrayal, the woman recalled, said something like, "You promised you wouldn't tell him." Then she threw a set of papers at her feet and walked off crying. Orlova didn't follow. She just stood there collecting the papers like it didn't surprise her. The hymn in question began to gnaw at Miss Marple. Could it have been Mr. Sims? His nervousness was consistent with someone who had been warned. If Judith had threatened to expose something and Orlova had done it instead, perhaps in a reading, it could explain both deaths, or perhaps it was someone else entirely, someone Judith had tried to protect. The web grew denser. Mrs. Tilling re-entered her thoughts with surprising clarity. Her alibi was frail, her reaction to the chrysanthemum too sharp. And if she had been seen near the caravan holding a flower, it suggested staging. But what reason could she have? Revenge? Jealousy? The answer began to form as Miss Marple revisited a seemingly trivial detail. Mrs. Tilling had once claimed to be close with Madame Orlova, but had also said the fortune-teller disliked flowers, especially chrysanthemums. Yet she admitted to gifting one once. It was a contradiction, subtle but telling. People who stage scenes always slip on the details. Perhaps Mrs. Tilling had hoped to frighten Orlova, leave her a flower as a threat, or as a reminder of Judith's grave. But if her intention had not been murder, how had it escalated? Had she found Orlova dead and panicked, or was she hiding something deeper? Miss Marple returned to the gloves Mr. Sims had left behind, which she had since placed in a small paper sack. The faint smell of marjoram was unmistakable, and there were tiny flecks of what looked like dried tea leaf under one nail. She took them to Dr. Bentley under the guise of needing his opinion on a strange stain. "That's herbal, all right," he said. "Marjoram and valerian, I'd wager. Common enough in sleeping blends." When she asked if such a mixture could be lethal, he frowned. "Not in normal quantities. But if enough valerian root is steeped, especially with alcohol or pre-existing heart conditions, it's not impossible." He looked up. "But what are you suggesting?" "Only that someone may have brought her the tea, not to kill perhaps, but to silence, or to keep her calm." Miss Marple's next visit was to Dora Appleton's older brother, who worked part-time at the post office. She asked gently if he ever ran errands for Madame Oliver. At first he denied it, then admitted he had once fetched herbs from the grocer, and once a sealed envelope to post. She said it was a gift for a friend. He muttered, "I don't know what was in it." Miss Marple asked who the friend might have been. He shrugged. She wouldn't say. Just that it was important it arrived before the new moon. Miss Marple felt a cold shiver run through her. That would have been 2 days before Judith's death. She pressed him further, and he hesitated. "There was a second envelope, now that I think of it. She never sent it. Left it on the desk. I asked about it once and she snapped. Told me never to touch her private things again. Do you remember a name?" "It was smudged, but it started with T." Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple laid her findings before the pieces. Judith discovered something, perhaps about Mrs. Tilling or Mr. Sims, or both. Perhaps she had planned to expose them and confided in Oliver. Oliver in turn used her readings to warn others, pushing both Mrs. Tilling and Sims toward panic. Each had motive. Sims to cover up an old scandal Judith may have been blackmailing him with, Tilling to preserve her standing, her secrets. And perhaps out of jealousy, Oliver had begun to distance herself. But neither theory fully explained the flowers, the timing, the fear. What tied them together, Miss Marple realized, was not intent, but miscalculation. Someone had tampered with the tea, thinking only to render Oliver quiet. Someone else had left the flower later to frame the scene. The murder had 2 culprits, or rather, 1 accidental death and 1 deliberate cover-up. If only she could prove which was which. As she sat by the fireplace, the knitting untouched beside her, she recalled Madame Orlova's words to Dora. "Be careful of people who pretend to help." That was it. Not a threat, a warning. Someone had come under the guise of kindness. Someone who brought tea, who offered sympathy, who stayed just long enough to make sure silence followed. The motive maze had many paths, but she was almost at the center now. One more conversation, one final thread, and the truth would unravel. By the following morning, the village buzzed with excitement as news spread that Constable Reeves had made an arrest. Mr. Sims, pale and sweating, had been brought in after an anonymous note was left at the constable's station, unsigned but explicit. It accused Sims of tampering with Madame Orlova's tea, of visiting her caravan late at night, and of attempting to erase his presence. The constable, never fond of ambiguity, saw the chance to close the case neatly and quickly. He retrieved the gloves from Miss Marple with stiff formality, waving away her polite mention of other leads, and proclaimed to anyone who'd listen that the stains confirmed it. The man laced the tea, simple as that. The postmistress, the baker, even the vicar's wife began repeating it as fact before noon. She always said he looked nervous, said Mrs. Carter, leaning over her garden gate. Only a guilty man sweats in the cold. The small crowd, gathered outside the station, whispered theories and nodded with satisfaction. But not Miss Marple. She watched it all unfold, with the faintest furrow in her brow, seated quietly near the edge of the green, knitting slowly but not looking at her work. The pieces didn't align. The anonymous note had arrived too conveniently, just as suspicion began turning in another direction. And Sims, for all his anxiety and contradictions, had seemed more confused than calculating. If he had poisoned the tea, why leave the gloves behind? Why return the next morning and linger at the fairground? Miss Marple had encountered guilty men before. They tended to flee or over-explain. Sims had done neither. She requested a brief audience with Constable Reeves, who begrudgingly agreed, pride already inflating with the imagined headline. "There's nothing more to say, Miss Marple," he told her as she stepped into the small, dark station office. His prints are on the cup, he had the herbs on his gloves, and a witness placed him near the caravan past his stated time. That's motive and opportunity. But motive is not certainty, Miss Marple said gently. And opportunity in this case is being confused with coincidence. "You have another theory?" he asked, leaning back. "I have unease, and I've learned to trust it." Outside, the village moved on. Mrs. Tilling, for the first time in days, appeared cheerful, her voice louder at the shops, her steps brisker. She called it closure. She called it relief. And that, Miss Marple noted, was precisely the problem. Mrs. Tilling had avoided conversation for days, reticent, withdrawn, her nerves frayed. But with Sims arrested, she flourished. Not with surprise, but with calm. Almost as if she had been waiting. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the caravan, still roped off, but no longer watched. A dog wandered nearby, and the wind rattled the eye, remaining bunting. The inside had been left mostly untouched since the first examination. She peered through the window, and her gaze settled again on the table. 2 chairs, 1 teacup. No second saucer. But something had bothered her about that. Layout from the beginning, she walked back toward the vicarage, her steps swift with purpose. There, she requested access to Madame Orlover's possessions, what had been collected after her death. Among them were her personal notebook, a pouch of coins, a single locked tin box, and a small stack of envelopes. Miss Marple asked to see the envelopes again. One bore a faded name, Judith Crail, another bore only an initial, T. It was dated 1 week before Orlover's death. The seal had been broken, likely by the constable. Inside was a single sheet, the writing in long, careful loops. I held my promise for as long as I could. But she knew. I saw her that night at the grave, and she knew it was not an accident. Judith told me everything before she died. I burned the letters, but I cannot carry this. If you decide to tell them, I will not stop you. I only ask you, let me place the flower. It was hers. No signature, but the initial matched, and so did the tone. Miss Marple folded the letter again and slipped it back inside. She spent the next hour speaking with Dora Appleton, who reluctantly confirmed that Mrs. Tilling had gone walking late at night once more, just days before Madame Orlover's death. She said she needed air, the girl murmured, but she came back with her. Sleeves dirty, and her hands smelled like earth and something sharp. That evening, Constable Reeves stood outside the station, his chest puffed with pride, when Miss Marple returned with a fresh statement and a request to revisit the caravan with him. It will only take a moment, she assured him. He followed her reluctantly, already irritated by her interference. Inside, she pointed to the teacup. You say his fingerprints were on this? Clear as day. But none on the saucer. There was no saucer. Then how was the cup carried? He frowned. I Suppose she held it, with a smudged lipstick mark on the left side, while seated on the right-hand chair. A woman who was meticulous, always used a saucer, and placed her cups to the right, as I've seen at the vicarage more than once. She moved toward the small shelf under the table, where a second saucer had been tucked away, faint traces of liquid dried on its edge. "Whoever brought the tea sat here," she said, pointing to the other chair, placed the cup, then hid the saucer before leaving. "And whoever left the flower came later." Constable Reeves looked uncertain. "You think Sims didn't do it?" "I think he was a tool. Frightened by Madame Orlova, perhaps coerced into delivering something, an envelope, a packet of herbs, but not murder. And I think the letter to T was her way of calling the final move." She paused. "Judith Crail died with tea at her bedside. Madame Orlova died with tea at her table. Both linked by someone who saw the past catching up and decided to silence it." The constable stood motionless. "You think it's Mrs. Tilling?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think you should ask her what promise she made to Judith, and why she feared the letters enough to burn them. Then perhaps ask her why she insisted on bringing flowers to a woman who hated them." As they stepped out of the caravan, a new hush fell over the green. The crowd that had celebrated Sims's arrest now paused, watching as Mrs. Tilling emerged from the bakery and saw the two of them together. Her smile faded. Her hand twitched near her pocket. And for the first time she did not look relieved. She looked cornered. The authorities had declared victory too soon. The true storm was just beginning to rise. Mrs. Tilling's expression as she stood outside the bakery gave Miss Marple the confirmation she had anticipated. The woman's smile had vanished the moment their eyes met. Her posture stiffened, and the usual quick-step enthusiasm melted into stillness, as if a single thread had snapped inside her. Miss Marple said nothing, merely offered a mild nod and turned to the constable beside her, who now appeared visibly less confident in his recent triumph. "It might be wise," she murmured, "to keep an eye on her this evening, quietly." Later, back at the vicarage, Miss Marple returned to the small locked tin box taken from Madame Orlova's belongings. The key had not been found among her things, and no one had yet thought to force it open. But the vicar's wife, ever practical, had lent Miss Marple a slender butter knife and a moment alone. It didn't take long. Inside were papers, faded letters, receipts, 2 old photographs, and a folded newspaper clipping dated 5 years prior. It was this last item that made her breath still. The article described the sudden death of a young woman in a boarding house in Basingstoke. One Amelia Crail. The name struck immediately. Judith Crail had no known siblings, but Amelia's photo resembled her closely, and the surname was no accident. Amelia's death had been attributed to an overdose of laudanum. The article explained assumed to be self-inflicted, but the final paragraph mentioned something unusual. She had been found after a séance had gone wrong, during a gathering hosted by an amateur medium who had vanished from the village shortly after. The name was not included. Miss Marple, however, had seen this story before, years ago, in a quieter column, tied to whispers and speculation in her local ladies' circle. And now, a second death, another Crail, tied again to a fortune-teller and to a woman who had recently grown far too quiet about her own past. Miss Marple laid the article beside the photographs. One image showed a group of 4 women and 1 man standing in front of a narrow townhouse smiling stiffly. Judith and Amelia were among them. The man was Mr. Sims, his face unmistakable, though younger and with more confidence. One of the women stood slightly behind the others, head half turned, but the figure and expression were unmistakably that of Mrs. Tilling. Miss Marple now understood why the name Crail had unsettled her. This wasn't a story that began in much Compton. It had simply returned here to finish. The past held more than secrets. It held guilt, Amelia Crail had died after a spiritual session gone wrong, and the people involved had scattered, reinvented themselves in quiet villages, hoping the story would fade, but Judith had not let it go. She had followed the threads, perhaps even blackmailed one or more of them. Sims, for example, whose nervousness made more sense now. He had reason to fear exposure, not only for Madame Orlover's death, but for the event that had ruined them all. Mrs. Tilling, more cautious, had likely tried to manage Judith, perhaps even befriended her to keep her close. But when Judith died, by tea in silence, no questions were asked. Miss Marple's suspicion sharpened. The tea blend, the same as Madame Orlover's, could not be coincidence. Someone had recreated the exact circumstances. Judith's death had been the test. Orlover's was the cover-up. But Orlover, perceptive and proud, had known. She had likely guessed who killed Judith, and prepared for her own end with as much grace as defiance. The envelope addressed to T now felt like a challenge, not just a warning, but a deliberate provocation. By the time Miss Marple returned to the green, dusk was settling in, and the constable met her with furrowed brows. "She's packing," he said quietly. "Claims she has a niece in Woking, says she needs to get away from the gossip." "Monsieur?" Marple nodded. "She's running, not escaping, and she won't get far." Together they walked to Mrs. Tilling's cottage, where the woman stood in her hallway with a small suitcase and a scarf knotted too hastily under her chin. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Miss Marple. "What now?" she asked. "Come to accuse me too?" "No," Miss Marple said gently, "only to ask if you remember Amelia Crail." The name struck like a bell. Mrs. Tilling's hand gripped the doorknob tighter. "That was years ago. Some memories last longer than others. The séance, the newspaper clipping, the way Judith always wore her sister's brooch, even here. She never forgot." "It was an accident," Mrs. Tilling whispered. "She wasn't supposed to take so much." "And yet she did," said Miss Marple. "And the medium vanished, and everyone else tried to vanish too. Except Judith. She followed you here. She threatened to tell everything," Mrs. Tilling snapped. "Said she'd ruin us all. She told all over too, and then she just died." "But she didn't," Miss Marple said softly. "She was given tea, just like all over. And you brought both cups. You thought you were preventing a scandal. In truth, you turned fear into murder." The silence that followed was deep and cold. Mrs. Tilling sank onto the chair by the wall, suitcase beside her, hands trembling. "I only wanted it to stop," she said. "Judith had letters. Orlover had cards. Everyone was always watching me, reminding me. I placed the flower so it would look symbolic, like something out of her own drama." Her voice broke. "I didn't know she'd drink it so fast." Constable Reeves stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "There is a difference," she said quietly, "between an accidental death and one repeated." The arrest was quiet. There was no resistance. The past, after all, had finally caught up. The shadows it cast had grown too long to outrun. And in the fading light, Much Compton found itself still again, but changed. As always, the truth had been there, buried in memory, only waiting for someone to uncover the roots. The following morning brought with it a thin mist curling across the village rooftops, softening the sharp edges left by the night's events. Word of Mrs. Tilling's arrest spread in hushed tones and darting glances, not with triumph as had followed Sims's detainment, but with something quieter, unease. It was the kind of guilt a village feels when someone they've known for years, someone invited to tea and asked to judge sponge cakes at Fate's, is led away in silence. Miss Marple, however, was not yet satisfied. The confession had closed one door, but another remained ajar. The truth, she felt with quiet certainty, had one piece still unsettled, too smooth, too simple, like a riddle answered too quickly. She returned to the vicarage study, where the tin box still lay open beside her notebook, the photographs, the letters, the article, all accounted for. But it was a detail from the photograph that returned to her now, the faint image of a necklace worn by Amelia Crail, a pendant in the shape of a crescent moon. It was barely visible, but Miss Marple had seen it before, worn recently and not by Judith. She paused, recalled the local museum display arranged weeks ago in the church hall, a temporary exhibit of antique trinkets and keepsakes from the village. Among them had been a crescent moon pendant on loan from Mrs. Carter, listed as found in the garden. Curious, Miss Marple paid her a visit under the pretense of returning a borrowed knitting pattern. "I don't suppose you still have that little crescent pendant from the church display?" she asked conversationally. Mrs. Carter smiled. "Oh, yes I do. It was just something I found last year while planting roses. I nearly tossed it out, thought it was junk." Miss Marple feigned polite surprise. "How curious. I'm sure I saw something quite like it in an old photograph of the Crail sisters. Perhaps it was dropped during a visit." "I doubt it," said Mrs. Carter breezily. "I don't recall them ever visiting this part of the lane. Judith was always up near the green." She paused, then added casually, "Of course Mr. Sims did come around a lot. Helped me with some repairs last year. Maybe he dropped it." The remark felt too quick, too rehearsed. Miss Marple filed it away, then thanked her hostess and returned home with a plan forming. The problem, she now suspected, was that Mrs. Tilling had not acted alone. Her confession was true, perhaps even sincere. But she had not been the only one moving in the shadows. The anonymous note that led to Sims's arrest, the staged symbolism of the chrysanthemum, the misplaced necklace, it suggested another hand, one more subtle and more careful, and if Mrs. Tilling had feared exposure, someone else had feared discovery. Someone who had watched, calculated, and perhaps even encouraged Tilling's desperate solution. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Mr. Sims to join her at the vicarage, under the pretense of clarifying the return of his gloves. He arrived looking worn but calmer, perhaps relieved the spotlight had shifted. Over tea, Miss Marple gently mentioned the necklace. "It's the oddest thing, you know. The same shape Amelia wore in that photograph. And now it's reappeared, conveniently, near someone else's garden." She watched him closely. He flinched barely, but enough. "I don't remember it," he said. "I never saw her wear it." "Then it must be coincidence," she said, lifting her cup. "Though it's strange, don't you think, that it would end up in this village, unless someone brought it here." She set the cup down. "Tell me, Mr. Sims, did you know that Madame Orlova kept a diary?" His eyes flicked to the side. "No. Pity. It's quite revealing. She wrote about Judith's suspicions, about someone in their old circle trying to move the blame elsewhere, about someone who still carried guilt not over what happened, but over how it might be remembered." She leaned forward, her tone still light. "She mentioned you, you know. Said you came to her once, asking if the spirits forgave. Odd thing to ask for an innocent man." Sims stood abruptly. "I think I've stayed too long." "Sit down, Mr. Sims." The voice was quiet but final. He hesitated, then sank back into the chair. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I never meant for any of it to go this far." "No," said Miss Marple. "But you certainly helped it along, didn't you? The anonymous letter to the constable, the necklace planted near Mrs. Carter's, the second flower on Judith's grave. Not the act of a grieving friend, but someone trying to mislead." His hands clenched. "Judith was going to ruin us all. She sent Amelia that night, told her to expose the séance as a fraud. Amelia didn't know what she was getting into. After her death, Judith wanted someone to blame. And when Orlova came here, she fed her lies. You convinced Mrs. Tilling to act," Miss Marple said softly. "You may not have poisoned the tea yourself, but you set the stage. Goaded her, stoked her fear, encouraged her silence, and when she broke, when she acted, you ensured the trail pointed elsewhere. Even offered her sympathy, I imagine. She was cracking already, Sims whispered. All I did was give her a reason to finish it. Miss Marple sat back. You've lived with this guilt a long time, Mr. Sims, but instead of facing it, you tried to reshape the story. You let others carry the blame. Even now, you want pity, not justice. He looked down at his hands. What happens now? That isn't for me to decide, Miss Marple said, but the truth at least is finally in the open. She stood, quietly rang the vicar for the constable, and returned to her knitting while the wheels of justice began again. This time, not rushed, not guessed, just slowly, inevitably, moving toward what had always been waiting beneath the surface. A single, unconventional clue, a necklace forgotten then found, had opened the final door. The past had spoken, and Miss Marple, as always, had listened. It was just before dawn when the quiet knock came at the vicarage door. The maid answered, with bleary eyes, and called up to Miss Marple, who rose without complaint and dressed swiftly, as though she had expected the interruption. Outside stood Constable Reeves, his hat in his hand, and a grim look set into his face. It's the box, he said. The one from all over's things. Someone's broken into the station. The box is gone. Miss Marple took a slow breath, then nodded once. And what about the contents you removed? The letters, the photograph, the clipping? Still there, he said. I'd kept them in my desk drawer, separated. But the tin itself's missing, along with the envelope addressed to T. His face flushed with frustration. They knew what to take. They walked together to the station, where the lock on the rear door had been forced, neatly, quickly, without the sort of mess one might expect from a desperate burglar. Nothing else had been touched. The ledgers remained, the typewriter undisturbed, the constable's own wallet left on the shelf. It was not a crime of profit, but of purpose. Miss Marple examined the door, the ground near the frame, and the faint scuff marks along the skirting. A small frame, she murmured. Someone familiar with the station's layout. Someone who knew what they were looking for. Sims had been held overnight in the next room. When Reeves questioned the sergeant, the report was firm. Sims had not left his cell. He's shaken, the sergeant said. I don't think he knew this would go that far. Keeps muttering about how she won't stop now. Reeves frowned. She? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she returned to the vicarage and sat quietly with her tea, the steam rising in the pale light of morning. Someone had risked much to retrieve or destroy the contents of that box. Not the photograph or the newspaper clipping. Those had served their purpose. But the letter to T, the one that hinted at complicity, the one that lacked a name but carried weight, that was what someone couldn't afford to leave behind. Her mind returned to Mrs. Carter's strange behavior. The necklace she had found in her garden. The quick association she'd made with Sims, though nothing had suggested he'd dropped it. The eagerness to redirect suspicion without being asked. It had all been too smooth. And now the theft, careful, efficient and targeted, seemed the work of someone who had experience covering tracks. Miss Marple had long known that people who live quietly often have the most to protect. She asked Reeves to accompany her to Mrs. Carter's that afternoon. They found her in the garden, pruning roses with her sleeves rolled up, and her expression overly composed. Such a shame about all this, she said. I can hardly believe it, poor Mrs. Tilling. And Sims, well, he always did seem odd. Miss Marple leaned on the gate. We've had a break-in at the station, she said gently. Someone took the tin box, the one Madame Orlova kept locked. Mrs. Carter paused. Strange. Who'd want that? That's what we're trying to determine. It contained private papers. including a letter written shortly before Orlova died. One that mentioned someone by initial, a T. Mrs. Carter's hand slipped slightly on the shears. "Well," she said, after a moment, "that doesn't help much, does it? Half the village has a T in their name." Miss Marple smiled. "Quite. It could have been Tilling, or perhaps even a first name. Teresa, for instance." There was a flicker, brief but there, in Mrs. Carter's eyes. Then a smile, tight and rehearsed. "You think I had something to do with it?" "I think someone feared that letter might become public," Miss Marple replied. "And I think someone with access to the rear of the station. Someone small enough to slip through the gap. Someone who has keys to several village buildings might have found it easier than most to act unnoticed." Constable Reeves stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "do you mind if we take a look inside your home? Just routine. Something to ease suspicion." She hesitated. "Is that necessary?" "I'm afraid it is," Miss Marple said gently. "The case isn't closed, and until we know who tried to destroy evidence, every open door must be checked." Reluctantly, Mrs. Carter allowed them in. The house was neat, polished, nothing out of place, but in the back room beside the sewing basket, Reeves noticed a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were the remnants of the tin box, flattened, scorched, slightly at the edges, as though it had been hammered and then placed in the fire. Too damaged to reconstruct, but recognizable in shape and size. Mrs. Carter sat down heavily. "I thought it was over," she muttered. "After Tilling confessed. After Sims cracked, I thought it would finally stay buried." Miss Marple sat across from her, voice calm. "You were part of the séance too." "I hosted it," she said. "Amelia was my cousin. She wanted to confront Judith, expose her for manipulating people, using secrets she didn't own. But Judith turned on her, told her to prove it, called her a coward. Amelia took too much laudanum before the session. I didn't know until it was too late. And afterward, the others disappeared. Sims changed his name. Tilling married and moved. I stayed. I always stayed. And when Judith came back into your life, you felt it all rise again." Miss Marple said. "She had letters. She kept them. Madame Orlova learned the truth from her. I begged Judith to let it go," Mrs. Carter whispered, "but she wouldn't. So I told Tilling. I said if she didn't act, Judith would destroy everything. She thought he would calm her, but Judith died, and then Orlova started hinting at things, and I couldn't risk it. I made sure the trail would never reach me." "You planted the necklace," Miss Marple said. "You wrote the anonymous letter. And now, you've tried to destroy the last link." Mrs. Carter nodded, a tremor running through her hands. "I was tired of hiding, but not ready to be ruined." The constable stepped forward with the quiet resignation of a man no longer surprised. The web had frayed further than he'd imagined. 3 people, each holding a corner of guilt. But it was the past that had killed Orlova. Not one act, but a chain of fear, shame, and silence. Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer, staring at the ashes of the tin box. The truth, once nearly complete, had almost vanished in smoke. But even as evidence burned, memory remained. And the mind, she knew, could be sharper than any lock. The village might soon forget the whispers, but not the silence that followed. And that, too, was a kind of justice. The village of Much Compton had just begun to settle back into its rhythm. With Mrs. Tilling in custody and Mrs. Carter's quiet confession added to the record, there was a collective exhale. Miss Marple noted it in the softer tones of conversation at the Green, the way people once again lingered outside the bakery, the cautious belief that perhaps after all the disruption, life would resume its quiet pattern. But Miss Marple herself did not exhale. Something still pulled at the edges of her thoughts, like a thread that refused to be snipped. Too many layers had built upon one another. Mistakes, guilt, concealments. And yet there remained the lingering sense of a presence. One player, perhaps more careful than the others, who had let the spotlight fall elsewhere while remaining untouched. The unease solidified when Constable Reeves knocked on the vicarage door that evening, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Sims is gone," he said flatly. "He's escaped." She blinked once. "Escaped from your custody." The sergeant found the cell empty this morning, window forced, lock tampered. He had help or tools, or both. And no one saw him, not a soul. Miss Marple took a long breath, then stood. "This is no longer clean-up," she said. "This is continuation." The constable's expression twisted. He ran because he was cornered. Or, she said, he ran because someone else told him to, or threatened him, or offered him a way out in exchange for silence. The day wore on with search efforts extending beyond the village, but Sims had vanished. No sightings, no leads. He had not returned to his rooms, left no note, and the roads in and out of Much Compton gave up nothing. Then, just before twilight, a boy delivering newspapers found something in the woods, a glove torn at the wrist, near a patch of flattened leaves. The constable retrieved it with care. Miss Marple examined it later under lamplight. "Not torn by brambles," she murmured. "Too clean. This was cut." That night, the village slept lightly. Rumors returned in full force, stronger than ever, whispering of unfinished business, conspirators still at large, and the return of something darker. Miss Marple remained by the fire, eyes on the flickering flame, letting her thoughts swim through the sequence again. Sims had not acted alone. Carter and Tilling had played their roles, but Sims had remained the link between the past and present, the hinge on which both stories turned. His escape, or disappearance, had broken that hinge. Then, not long after midnight, a scream tore through the quiet. Miss Marple was already standing by the time the maid reached her room. Outside, near the church path, Dora Appleton was found, trembling beside the old stone wall, clutching at her nightgown, eyes wide with terror. It took a long time to coax speech from her. When she finally did speak, the words were thin and breathless. "He was there," she whispered, "at the window, watching, but not moving, just staring." "Who, child?" Miss Marple asked, kneeling beside her. "Sims," she said, "or someone dressed like him." The house was searched, the path scoured. No footprints, but the grass near Dora's window had been pressed down, recently and deliberately. Inside her room, the windowsill had been marked by fingers, dusty and uneven. But nothing had been taken, and no one had entered. Whoever it was had only watched. By morning, the panic had returned to Much Compton like a tide, and in its wake came the news that changed the course of everything. Madame Orlova's diary, which had been left in Miss Marple's care, was gone. Not misplaced, not forgotten. Gone. The drawer it had been stored in was locked the night before, but the lock was undamaged. Nothing else was touched, no sign of a break-in. It had simply vanished. Miss Marple stood silently in the vicar's study, hand resting lightly on the now empty drawer. Someone knew exactly what they were after, she said, and exactly when to take it. Constable Reeves stood nearby, face drawn. But who? Carter's in custody, Tilling still being held, Sims is gone, or worse. "It's not just about those three," she murmured. "There's someone else. Someone who remained in the background through all of it. Who knew when to act and how to stay unnoticed. This person didn't panic like Carter, didn't confess like Tilling, didn't run like Sims. They've watched." Reeves asked, "Why take the diary now?" Miss Marple turned to the window, watching the fog creep over the hedges. Because it held the final piece. Not evidence, perhaps, but names, memories, the order of things. Orlova was careful. She knew the truth had power, and someone couldn't risk that truth surfacing. It was then that a second report came from the far end of the village, from the gardener who tended the cemetery. "The grave," he said. "The one for Judith Crail. It's been disturbed." Reeves and Miss Marple arrived moments later. The grave hadn't been opened fully, but the fresh earth had been turned. Not as if someone were exhuming, but as if they'd left something behind. A box buried just beneath the surface, marked with wax seals, and an envelope beneath the lid. It was sealed in a layer of linen and string. They opened it there, beneath the grey sky, and found within it a second journal. One Orlova must have prepared for seeing danger. The pages were written in code, simple but effective, built on astrological symbols and initials. And there, halfway through, was a name neither Reeves nor Miss Marple had yet uttered aloud. Reverend Lionel Hatchford. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. "Of course," she said. The Reverend had been in place 10 years, soft-spoken, generous, helpful in all matters, yet always present. Present at Judith's funeral, present during the questioning of witnesses, present when Orlova's belongings were catalogued, present when Sims had been questioned behind closed doors, never once drawing attention. The diary mentioned him by his early name, Leonard Harwood. He'd changed it after a family scandal, something buried in London's darker corners. He had once been engaged to Amelia Crail, left her shortly before the séance. After her death, he vanished, only to return under a new identity, in a quiet village, bearing spiritual authority and avoiding the past. Now Miss Marple understood. It was never just about guilt. It was about erasure, someone who wished not only to bury the past, but to own the present. Someone who had helped orchestrate a tragedy, then built a life on the silence that followed. When the past threatened to speak again, Judith, Orlova, even Sims, they were handled, one by poison, one by manipulation, one by fear. But someone had underestimated the strength of memory, and of an old woman who noticed more than she spoke. There would be no rest until this final player stepped into the light. The game was no longer about solving a death. It was about stopping another. The day after the discovery of the second journal and the revelation about Reverend Lionel Hatchford, Miss Marple sat by the fire at the vicarage, her knitting abandoned beside her, the empty chair opposite her as still as her thoughts. The pieces had all been there, scattered, half-hidden, yet now they began to assemble with slow certainty. Hatchford's name had been the final missing thread, the key that made sense of every erratic movement, every subtle slip, and the pattern that had been in plain sight all along. She recalled the first conversation she'd had with Hatchford years ago, shortly after he'd arrived in Much Compton. He had been kind, even charming in his own gentle way, but there had always been something about him, something that set him apart from the other villagers. His manner so perfectly composed, his tendency to listen rather than speak, the way he always seemed to know just when and how to offer help. He had been present at every crucial moment, never conspicuous, yet never absent either. She had never questioned it before, assuming it was his role as a reverend that required him to be involved. But now, looking back, his presence at every turn, particularly during moments of tension, felt more like a subtle thread being pulled by unseen hands. The village had been quick to trust him, as they often did with those who wore the mantle of respectability, but Miss Marple had learned over the years that such trust could be both a blessing and a curse. It had allowed Hatchford to remain hidden in plain sight, to keep his secrets buried beneath a polished surface. The village had not questioned him, because he had made them feel safe. But safety, Miss Marple knew, often veiled the most dangerous threats. She thought about the missing diary entries in Orlova's journal, the ones Hatchford must have erased or altered in some way. She had seen the clues in his subtle manipulations, his carefully chosen words, his connection to Judith, his attempt to steer suspicion away from himself, and his relentless influence on the events surrounding Madame Orlova's death. It was all starting to make sense. It was then that an offhand remark from Mrs. Carter came back to her. The day before the arrest, Mrs. Carter had mentioned something about the old ways, the way people used to deal with their troubles, before everything became so complicated. She'd said it almost in passing, as if it were a casual comment, but Miss Marple now recognized it as a signal, a hint toward something darker. Hatchford, like Mrs. Carter, had clung to the past, an unspoken history of manipulation and control. The connection between the two of them was clearer now. It had been Hatchford's influence, not just Judith's, that had drawn Madame Orlova into the village. It was no coincidence that Orlova had been aware of so many hidden truths, nor that she had mentioned in her diary the name of someone who was going to be exposed. Orlova, in her own subtle way, had known that the Reverend was far from the pious figure he appeared to be, and she had been determined to expose him, slowly, deliberately, but too late. Miss Marple stood up, her movements deliberate, her thoughts gathering like storm clouds. She had one more piece to retrieve, one final confrontation to stage. The pattern that had seemed disjointed now fell into place with terrible clarity. The threads led to Hatchford. The Reverend, a man who had spent years pulling the strings from the shadows, was now at the center of it all. He was the one who had orchestrated the deaths, manipulated events, and ensured that the past remained buried. But he had underestimated one thing. He had underestimated Miss Marple. As she made her way to the church, her mind turned to the subtle clues she had noticed earlier. The way Hatchford had always remained just outside suspicion. The way he had been present, but never actively involved in any of the crucial moments. It was like a game he had been playing, one in which the rules favored his silence, his absence, and the manipulation of those around him. Now, however, the game was over. The pieces were finally falling into place, and he no longer had control. The church, she found him in the vestry as she expected. His back was to her, his hands moving through a stack of papers on his desk, but he stiffened slightly when he heard the door creak open. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said without turning. "I didn't expect you so soon. I had a feeling you wouldn't be in the village much longer, Reverend," she replied quietly, "and I thought I might catch you before you made your final departure." Hatchford turned slowly, his face pale, but his eyes cold. "You have no evidence, Miss Marple. Nothing you've uncovered has any true value. The village believes me to be innocent, and you know as well as I do that without hard proof, it's all just words." "Ah, but it's more than just words, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice low but firm. "You've been careful, so careful, but it's the little things that always reveal the truth. The way you've woven yourself into the fabric of this village, the way you've manipulated those around you to keep your secrets, the people you've used, and the lives you've destroyed." Hatchford's lips tightened. "You have no idea what you're talking about. The past is the past. I've left it behind, and so should you." Miss Marple shook her head. "The past never stays buried, Reverend. It has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it." His gaze faltered for a moment before he composed himself. "You don't know what it was like. Amelia, Judith, I had no choice. They would have ruined everything I've built. I didn't kill them. I only wanted to protect my future." "You're right," Miss Marple said softly. "You didn't kill them in the way you think. You poisoned their lives, and when they threatened to expose you, you poisoned them in other ways, first with fear, then with silence. And in the end, you erased the evidence, hoping no one would ever find out." But there are always cracks, Reverend. And those cracks always let the light in. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. It's time to face the consequences, Lionel. The room seemed to grow still, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling around them. Hatchford's breath hitched, his facade slipping for just a moment. But before he could respond, the door burst open. Reeves, followed by 2 officers, entered swiftly, taking in the scene with a mixture of confusion and resolution. "Reverend," Reeves said quietly, "we found your journals, and the final piece." Hatchford's face drained of color, and for the first time he looked like a man truly caught in his own web. Miss Marple watched him closely. "It's over now," she said gently. "You've hidden in plain sight for far too long. But the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how hard you try to bury it." As the officers stepped forward to make the arrest, Miss Marple remained standing by the door, her mind already turning toward the next steps. The village would heal eventually, though it would take time. The darkness that had hung over it for so long had finally been lifted. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that truth, once uncovered, could never be contained. And in the end, it was the truth that had brought them all to this moment. As the officers led Reverend Lionel Hatchford away, Miss Marple stood motionless in the vestry, her mind moving through the events with slow precision. It wasn't the arrest itself that had unsettled her. It was the unraveling of something far deeper, a hidden motive that had only begun to reveal itself. Hatchford had been driven by fear, yes, fear of exposure, of being discovered for the man he truly was. But there was something else, something darker, something that had twisted his actions into a relentless, suffocating desire for control, even over the very lives he had once held dear. After the Reverend had been taken to the station, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. The house felt quieter than usual, the air heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. She sat by the fire, her hands resting lightly on the arm of her chair. The pieces had fallen into place, but the final image, the real reason behind the crimes, was still out of focus. It wasn't about money. That had been the easy explanation, the one that made sense at first. The money, the debts, the potential for blackmail. But Miss Marple knew better. The Reverend Hatchford wasn't a man motivated by greed, not in the way others were. His manipulation of others, his calculated moves, had never been about acquiring wealth. No, it was something deeper, something psychological. She thought back to the conversations, the details she had gathered, the subtle moments when Hatchford's words had hinted at something more. His demeanor had always been one of quiet authority, yet beneath it lay a certain desperation, a desire not just to control the village, but to control the narrative of his own life. The name change, the new identity, the calculated distance from his past. All of it had been part of the same strategy: to bury the truth so deeply that it could never rise again. Miss Marple had always known that people who fear the past often create their own false realities to live in. Hatchford's reality, however, was one that had cost him dearly. His relationship with Amelia Crail, his abandonment of her, had set the stage for everything that followed. But it wasn't the abandonment itself that had haunted him. It was the shame. The shame of his own weakness, the guilt of leaving someone he once loved, someone who had trusted him. He had been running from that guilt ever since. And in the end, it had twisted into something far darker than he could have imagined. The second murder, that of Judith Crail, had been the tipping point. Judith had been a reminder of everything Hatchford had tried to erase. She had known the truth about his past, and she had known what he had done to Amelia. When Judith had come to the village seeking closure or perhaps revenge, Hatchford had seen it as his final reckoning. But he wasn't just trying to silence her. He was trying to stop the truth from ever being spoken aloud. Because if it was, everything he had worked for would come crumbling down. The respectability he had built as a reverend, the quiet life he had forged in Much Compton, would be shattered. But the worst part, Miss Marple realized, was that Hatchford hadn't just killed Judith because she threatened his secret. He had killed her because, in his mind, she had the power to undo everything he had become. She was a symbol of his failure, a reminder of a life he could never fully escape. And in that twisted logic, he had justified her death. The same way he had justified his abandonment of Amelia. The same way he had manipulated Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Tilling. In his mind, they were all just pieces in a game he could control, no different than the villagers who blindly trusted him. The real motive, then, wasn't just about hiding the past. It was about self-preservation, but not in the way most people understood it. For Hatchford, the preservation of his life, his identity, was not just a matter of keeping his secret safe. It was about maintaining his own fragile sense of self. The moment Judith threatened to expose him, she had become an existential threat, not just a physical one. He couldn't afford to let her live because if she did, she would destroy the very fabric of the life he had worked so hard to build. Miss Marple sat back, her fingers clasped together. The pattern was clearer now, and it was more complex than she had first realized. It wasn't enough to look at the surface of a crime and assume you understood the motive. People didn't always kill for revenge, or money, or power. Sometimes they killed because they were terrified of who they were, of what they had become. Hatchford had been running from his own self-loathing, and when it finally caught up to him, he had reacted with violence, as if to stave off the inevitable confrontation with his own guilt. She had seen it before in small ways in different people. The way a person could hide behind a mask for so long, fooling everyone, even themselves, until finally that mask cracked, and the truth could no longer be ignored. It was a tragedy, really. The lives Hatchford had destroyed, Amelia, Judith, even Sims, were all collateral damage in his own battle with himself. Miss Marple thought about the last time she had seen him standing in the vestry, trying so hard to maintain his composure. He had believed until the very end that he could control everything, that the past, the guilt, the memories, could all be kept in check. But it had all come crashing down. His own psychology, his obsession with controlling his narrative, had led him to murder. And now, it had led him to this moment. His undoing. She stood, walking to the window, her eyes scanning the village below. It was peaceful now, almost eerily so. The storm that had raged through Much Compton had finally passed, and the village seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But Miss Marple knew better. The storm had only been momentary. Beneath the calm surface, there was still the lingering ripple of what had happened. The effects of Hatchford's crimes would be felt for a long time to come. But at least the truth was finally out. In the end, that was what mattered most. The truth had a way of working its way to the surface, no matter how hard one tried to bury it. And in this case, it had taken Miss Marple to bring it into the light. The pieces had come together, and the hidden motive, one far more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined, had been revealed. The case was closed, but the lessons remained. Sometimes the darkest motives come from the most unexpected places, and in the quietest corners there are always secrets waiting to be uncovered. The days following Hatchford's arrest had brought a calm that felt to Miss Marple more like a prelude than a resolution. The village seemed to breathe easier with every passing moment, but the undercurrent of unease still lingered, as though there was something more that had yet to surface, something that hadn't been fully addressed. And it was in the quiet corners of her mind that Miss Marple began to sense the final piece, the one she had almost overlooked in the rush of uncovering Hatchford's many layers of deceit. The Reverend, had been arrested, his confession recorded. But there was no closure. No satisfaction in knowing that all the guilty parties had been brought to justice. There was still the sense that someone had played a more significant role in this than anyone had realized. Someone who had manipulated Hatchford and orchestrated much of the deceit from the shadows. That someone, Miss Marple now knew, had not been as careful as they thought. She gathered her things and made her way to the vicarage, where Constable Reeves was waiting. The news was already out. The arrest had been made. The village had been told the truth, but Miss Marple was still restless. She knew there was more to it than just Hatchford's guilt. As she sat across from Reeves, she looked at him with quiet resolve. "There's one thing left to do, Constable." He raised an eyebrow, his tired eyes betraying the strain of the past few weeks. "And what's that, Miss Marple?" "Confrontation. The person who's been watching all along, who thinks they're clever enough to evade the law. It's time they realize they've been outplayed." Reeves' eyes darkened. "You think there's someone else?" "I do," she said simply, her gaze narrowing. "I believe there's one more player. One who's been hiding in plain sight. And now that Hatchford has been caught, they'll be desperate to cover their tracks." The next morning, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Carter once more, this time under the guise of a final chat, to ensure there were no more hidden details to uncover. Mrs. Carter greeted her with a forced smile, clearly trying to appear at ease. But there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. She was fidgeting, tapping her fingers nervously on the edge of the kitchen table. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Carter?" Miss Marple asked gently, setting down her bag. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple," Mrs. Carter replied, her voice too smooth. "I'm just fine. Everything's settled. What else is there to discuss?" Miss Marple observed her carefully. "You've been very helpful, of course. I was thinking, though, perhaps there's something more you could tell me about your relationship with Reverend Hatchford, about the way things used to be." Mrs. Carter stiffened, her hands stilling on the table. "I don't know what you mean. I've told you everything." Miss Marple's voice remained calm but firm. "You were in the room when the séance took place. You were there when everything started to unravel. But you haven't told me why you were so desperate to protect Hatchford, or why you were so eager to play the role of confidant." Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered, and for a moment she looked like a woman cornered by the truth. Miss Marple didn't wait for her to speak. "I believe you were more involved in all of this than you've let on, Mrs. Carter. You weren't just trying to keep the past buried. You were trying to protect something even more precious to you than your reputation." The words hit their mark. Mrs. Carter's eyes darted to the window, and in that brief moment, Miss Marple saw it. Fear. Genuine fear. "You were involved in more than just the past," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but unyielding. "You were protecting Hatchford's secret. The truth about Amelia Crail. The truth about what happened to her. You didn't want anyone to know because you were complicit in her death. You helped orchestrate the cover-up. You knew that Judith would never stop digging, and when she got too close, you knew exactly what needed to be done." Mrs. Carter stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I didn't do anything. I didn't. You were too close to the situation, Mrs. Carter," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Too close to Hatchford. You were complicit in the lies. And now you're the one who's been left behind to cover up the final pieces of the puzzle. You're trying to control the narrative just like Hatchford did. Only now the stories slipping through your fingers." Mrs. Carter's face twisted with anger. "I did what I had to do. I couldn't let it all come out. You don't understand. You have no idea what it's like, living with all of this, living with the fear that someone will find out what really happened." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "I understand more than you think, Mrs. Carter. I know what it's like to live with the consequences of choices. But this isn't the way to make it right." Before Mrs. Carter could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Miss Marple's eyes met Mrs. Carter's for a split second, and in that moment, the tension was broken. It was over. The confrontation had begun. Constable, Reeves and 2 other officers entered the room. Mrs. Carter, I'm afraid you're under arrest for your role in the deaths of Amelia Crail and Judith Crail, as well as the conspiracy to cover up the truth. Reeves said quietly, his voice steady. Mrs. Carter recoiled, but there was no escape. Her eyes flickered between Miss Marple and the officers, and in that moment she knew it was over. She had been playing her own game of deception, thinking she could control the outcome. But she had been outwitted, and Miss Marple had finally put the pieces together. As the officers led Mrs. Carter away, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. She had known all along that the true motive behind the crimes was not just about protecting Hatchford or even keeping the past hidden. It was about the fear of being exposed, the fear that in the end the truth would come to light, no matter how much one tried to bury it. The village would heal in time, but the scars would remain. For Miss Marple, it was just another case closed, another truth uncovered. But for Mrs. Carter and for Hatchford, it would be the end of their carefully constructed lies. The trap had been set, and the final confrontation had revealed the hidden motive, fear, guilt, and the unrelenting desire to control a past that could never be fully erased. The days following Mrs. Carter's arrest were quiet, at least on the surface. The village of Much Compton, still reeling from the whirlwind of secrets, began to settle back into its familiar rhythms. The local gossip, always eager to latch onto the next scandal, now seemed satisfied with the closure of the case. Reverend Hatchford, his confession sealing his fate, would stand trial in a matter of weeks. Mrs. Carter, too, would face justice for her part in the tragedy that had unfolded over the past several months. Yet as the days passed, Miss Marple found herself strangely unsettled. There had been something in Mrs. Carter's eyes when the officers took her away, something not quite finished. It wasn't the terror of a guilty woman caught at last, nor the defiance of someone who believed they could still escape. No, it was the flicker of recognition, a fleeting moment when Mrs. Carter had realized that her game too was about to end, but that someone else's wasn't. Miss Marple spent her evenings in quiet contemplation, replaying every word, every gesture. It wasn't until the early hours of the following morning that it struck her, like a light bulb suddenly igniting in a dark room. The piece she had missed. The piece that had been in plain sight, but hidden by the chaos of the investigation. The final twist that had been overlooked, and it all centered around one word: Tilling. Mrs. Tilling had confessed to her role in the murders. Yes, she had told the truth, or so it seemed, but there had been a slip, a subtle detail in her confession that Miss Marple had ignored at the time. Mrs. Tilling had mentioned something in passing about a final arrangement, a pact of sorts, made with someone else. A man, she had said, who had promised to help her cover her tracks. The details had been vague, but now, looking back, Miss Marple saw it for what it was: a clue. There had been one person who had been too quiet throughout the entire investigation, one person who had stayed in the shadows, never once drawing attention to himself. The constable's assistant, a young man named Paul Simmons, who had been present at almost every stage of the investigation, but never spoken more than necessary. He had never seemed overly concerned with the developments, nor had he shown any real emotion when the confessions had been made. He was always just there. It was then that Miss Marple remembered the small, almost insignificant detail she had seen at the beginning of the case: the way Paul Simmons had moved when the villagers began speaking about Reverend Hatchford's past. There was a brief moment, a glance exchanged with Mrs. Tilling, one that had been so fleeting she had almost missed it. But now, in the light of everything that had transpired, it stood out like a glaring red flag. Miss Marple set off immediately. For the constable's office, a quiet resolve settling over her. She needed to speak with Paul Simmons. She needed to ask him the questions that no one else had thought to ask. When she arrived, Simmons was alone, sitting at his desk, eyes cast downward, as if lost in thought. He looked up when she entered, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "Is there something I can help you with?" Miss Marple closed the door gently behind her and approached his desk. "Yes, Paul. There's something we need to discuss, something that has been overlooked, something about your involvement in this case." Simmons tensed, his eyes darting to the door as if seeking an escape, but he didn't move. "I don't know what you mean," he said, though the lie was evident in his voice. "You were there at every key moment," Miss Marple said softly. "When Hatchford was arrested, when Mrs. Tilling confessed. You never seemed particularly concerned, did you? Always calm, always observant, never too eager to speak up. But there's something I noticed. A certain connection." Simmons swallowed hard, his face paling. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The truth always has a way of coming to light, Paul. And I believe you've been keeping a few truths to yourself. I think you know more than you've let on." The young man's eyes flickered nervously. "I've only been doing my job, Miss Marple. I've been helping Constable Reeves with his duties. That's all." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "You've been helping, yes, but not in the way you think. You were involved with Mrs. Tilling, weren't you? You were the one who arranged for the cover-up. You helped her make sure that Hatchford was never exposed, that he stayed in control. You helped her make sure that the village would never learn the truth." Simmons' face twisted with panic. "That's not true. You're wrong." "Am I?" Miss Marple asked softly, watching him carefully. "You and Mrs. Tilling had a plan, didn't you? You were both involved in the deaths of Judith and Amelia Crail. You were part of the conspiracy, and you were the one who helped orchestrate it all, using Reverend Hatchford as a pawn." Simmons' breath came quicker now, his hands shaking as they gripped the edge of the desk. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean for them to die. It was just supposed to be a scare, a way to keep them quiet, to make them leave us alone. But it got out of hand. I didn't want this." Miss Marple's gaze never left him. "You didn't want this. And yet you still helped carry out the murders. You helped silence Judith and Amelia just to protect your own secret, just to keep things from unraveling." Simmons' head dropped, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "We never meant to hurt anyone," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I didn't know how far it would go. But once Mrs. Tilling started, I couldn't stop. I was already in too deep." Miss Marple stood slowly, her hands folded in front of her. "That's the thing with secrets, Paul. They grow. They fester. And when they're buried long enough, they start to come to the surface in ways you never expected." Simmons sat there trembling as the reality of his actions finally sank in. Miss Marple turned to leave, but paused at the door. "It's over now, Paul. The truth will always find its way through. It may take time, but it always catches up." And with that she left, the final twist of the case now revealed. The true mastermind had been hiding in plain sight all along. Someone who had been just as willing to go to extreme lengths to cover their tracks. The case was finally over. But Miss Marple knew that the consequences would linger far beyond the village of Much Compton. The truth, once uncovered, could never be contained. The days that followed Paul Simmons' confession were long and quietly unsettling. The arrest, while confirming Miss Marple's suspicions, had brought no real sense of resolution. The case, once closed with a neatness that felt too good to be true, now sat heavily in the air. Miss Marple had seen this before, the feeling of something left undone, something incomplete. Justice had been served in part, but something about the manner in which it had all unraveled left an itch that couldn't be scratched. It was in the early evening, as the last of the daylight began to fade from the village, that Miss Marple's fears were confirmed. She had spent the afternoon reviewing the final pieces, piecing together the small inconsistencies, the overlooked details, things that in the rush of the investigation everyone had missed. And now she was no longer certain that all the guilty parties had been caught. There was something still lurking just out of reach. The constable arrived at the vicarage just after dinner, his expression strained, his hat in his hand. He looked as though he had aged 10 years since the morning. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, almost apologetically, "I need to speak with you. It's about Simmons." Her heart tightened as she gestured for him to sit. "What happened, Constable?" Reeves's voice was tight with frustration. "He's gone. Disappeared. I checked the cell. He's not there. The door was locked. No sign of struggle. Nothing missing, just gone. The same way as Hatchford." Miss Marple's thoughts raced. "You're sure? No one saw anything?" "No one saw him leave," he said. "But I've been going through the paperwork. The journals. His journal. There's a pattern, Miss Marple. I missed it the first time around, but now, looking back, there's something in his writing. Something about how he thought he could escape. He knew exactly what would happen once Mrs. Carter was arrested. He knew he would be caught too, if things went on like this." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place, but the pieces felt wrong. "It was always going to be him, wasn't it?" she said softly, almost to herself. "He wasn't just helping Tilling cover her tracks. He was the one who put the final plan into motion, not just out of fear, but because he wanted it. He wanted to take control of the narrative." She paused, and when it started to slip away from him, he ran. Reeves nodded grimly. "It seems so. I didn't see it before. But now it's all falling into place. We've been chasing the wrong people. Simmons wasn't just an accomplice, he was the one orchestrating it all." Miss Marple stood, her movements measured as if she were already several steps ahead of the constable. "That's the thing about people like Simmons," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "They think they're playing the game, when, in truth, they're simply pawns themselves. They don't realize they're part of a bigger plan. Until it's too late." The constable's frustration deepened, but he didn't argue. "But if he's gone, what do we do now?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she looked out the window toward the church steeple, her thoughts turning inward, focusing on the final pieces she had missed earlier. "We track him. We think like him. If Simmons planned his escape as carefully as he orchestrated the cover-up, then he's already calculated his next move. He's not finished. He still believes he can outwit us." Reeves opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand, cutting him off. "Don't worry about what we've missed, Constable. We've all overlooked things in the heat of the chase. But I know how he thinks now, and that's the one advantage we have. Simmons isn't just hiding. He's trying to leave us a message. And he's left a trail." With a sharp motion, she walked toward the door. "The church," she said more to herself than to Reeves. "He'll think he's safe there. It's where the narrative began after all. But this time, he won't be in control of the story. This time, he'll play right into our hands." They made their way to the church together, the evening shadows deepening around them, the weight of the moment settling like fog. Miss Marple's instincts, as always, were spot on. As they reached the church door, they found it slightly ajar. Inside, the air was still, but there was a distinct tension that hadn't been there before. "Simmons," Miss Marple murmured. She stepped forward, her steps sure, her senses alert. "He's here." They entered the nave slowly, moving with caution. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the back, near the vestry. Miss Marple gestured for Reeves to follow her as they approached the sound, the suspense growing heavier with every step. She had never been wrong in her assessment of people, of patterns, but this time felt different. The air hummed with the knowledge that whatever was about to happen would change everything. There, standing at the altar, was Simmons. He was facing the back of the church, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't heard them enter. His head snapped around when he heard the rustling of Reeves' boots on the stone floor, his eyes wide and wild. The air shifted with tension, and for a brief moment it seemed as though he might bolt. But then, as if resigned to the inevitable, he slowly turned to face Miss Marple. There was no sign of fear in his eyes, only a cold, calculating resolve. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "You think you've got it all figured out, but you're wrong." Miss Marple stood still, her gaze unwavering. "You've underestimated me, Paul. You thought you could escape, that you could hide in plain sight. But you made a mistake. You assumed I wouldn't notice the subtle cracks in your story. You thought you could play the game and not get caught. But you've left a trail that led me straight to you." Simmons' lips curled into a half-smile. "You really do think you've outsmarted me, don't you understand? I've been in control of this whole time, not Hatchford, not Carter, me, and now. It's too late." He moved suddenly, drawing something from his pocket, something cold and metallic. Miss Marple didn't flinch, but her hand moved ever so slightly, as though preparing for what she knew was coming. "You've played your part, Paul," she said softly. "But you never realized that I was always one step ahead." Before Simmons could make a move, Reeves lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The struggle lasted only moments as the EE officers rushed in to restrain him. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, and Simmons, realizing his game had ended, sagged against the floor, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. Miss Marple took a breath, her pulse steady. The investigation had seemed over so many times before. But it wasn't until this final twist that she truly understood how deeply Simmons had believed in his own superiority. He had underestimated her once again. As they led Simmons out of the church, Miss Marple glanced up at the stained glass windows, the dim light filtering through them like a silent witness. The village had been deceived, but now, at last, the truth was out. And in the end, it was always the truth that had been the final trap. Justice had been served, but not by the hands of anyone but Miss Marple. She had seen through the deception, tracked the trail of lies, and caught the true mastermind. And now, all that was left was the quiet aftermath, where the pieces of the past would finally settle into place. The final moments of the investigation were peaceful, but the weight of the mystery still hung in the air, as if the village itself hadn't quite absorbed the depth of the secrets it had buried. As Miss Marple walked away from the station, her mind settled on the familiar patterns she had noticed throughout the case. The way certain clues had seemed too easy, too neatly aligned, and how others had slipped through her fingers only to resurface when she least expected it. For a brief moment, she allowed herself the luxury of relief. The case had been solved, and justice had been served. But even as she walked, something tugged at her thoughts, something she couldn't quite shake. She paused at the churchyard gates, watching the last of the daylight disappear over the horizon. Her gaze lingered on the rows of gravestones, each one a marker of the lives that had been, the stories that had ended. But in her mind, another story, still unfinished, whispered to her, just out of reach, like a forgotten note in a long-forgotten song. There had been something in Simmons' eyes when the officers had restrained him. He had looked surprised, yes, but there had also been a knowing glance, one that Miss Marple hadn't caught until it was too late. It wasn't fear. It wasn't Defiance, it was something else, something more familiar. He knew something she didn't. And now, with him in custody, that question, the one that had haunted her for the past few days, lingered, unspoken but pressing. As she turned to leave, heading back to the vicarage to enjoy the silence that had settled over the village, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a subtle shift. The pieces of the puzzle were all accounted for, yet something about the way they fit together didn't feel final. Not just with Simmons, but with everyone involved in the case. There was still a thread that didn't tie off properly, a question that remained unanswered. Had Simmons been the only one behind the final orchestrations, or had there been another force still working in the background? The next morning, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, knitting quietly, when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Constable Reeves standing on the threshold, a familiar look of uncertainty in his eyes. "Miss Marple, there's something I didn't mention before," he said, his voice low and hesitant. She gestured for him to enter. "What is it, Constable?" "It's about the letter," he said. "The one Simmons received before he ran." Her fingers stilled on the knitting needle. "You didn't tell me about this before," she said, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. "I should have," Reeves admitted, stepping inside. "I didn't realize how important it was at the time. But when I went through his things this morning, I found it. An envelope, tucked under the lining of his coat." He handed her a small folded piece of paper. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, reading the cryptic message scrawled inside. It was brief, but its meaning was clear. "You've done your part, now it's time to finish it, don't let her win." She looked up at Reeves. This was left for him, wasn't it? Someone else was in control. Reeves nodded, the weight of his realization pressing down on him. "I don't know who could have left it. But whoever it was, they knew exactly how to push Simmons into action. They knew he'd run, knew he'd try to escape. It wasn't just about covering their tracks. It was about leaving us with a trail." Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes narrowing in thought. "The message is too vague to tell us much," she said softly. "But the fact that Simmons was being guided, controlled, suggests that he wasn't working alone. Someone else was pulling the strings from the shadows just as they had when the whole scheme began. This isn't over, Constable." Reeves looked unsettled. "But we've caught everyone involved. Hatchford's confessed, Carter, Tilling, Simmons, all in custody. Who else could be behind it?" "I don't know," Miss Marple replied. "But I have a feeling they're closer than we think. And it won't be long before they try to slip away." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation settled in. They had thought the case was closed, yet the message had made it clear. There was another piece of the puzzle still missing. Someone who had been hidden in plain sight. Someone who had always been one step ahead, watching from the shadows. "I'll have to dig deeper," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze fixed on the fire, as if it might reveal something she had missed. "The pieces of the past aren't fully in place yet. But I'll find it." Reeves hesitated, then nodded. "I'll help however I can." She stood picking up her knitting again, as if the events of the past days had been just another case. "To resolve, we'll need to be patient, Constable. The truth has a way of hiding itself, especially when people are so desperate to bury it." As Miss Marple sat back down, her thoughts drifting through the threads of the case, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer had always been there, right before her eyes. But the final revelation, the real mastermind behind it all, had been elusive. A puzzle she had yet to solve. The village would move on. They would rebuild, and life would continue. But the questions that lingered in Miss Marple's mind wouldn't be so easily dismissed. She knew that whatever was still hidden would surface, and when it did, it would change everything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Miss Marple felt an old, familiar thrill, the thrill of a mystery that had only just begun to reveal its true face.